want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
My guest today on the Enemies List is Byron Tau. He is a reporter with the Wall Street Journal and has covered everything from the Robert Mueller investigation to the 2016 campaign. He has been at Politico. You've read and seen his work almost everywhere. He is a terrific writer, and he's joining us today to talk about his absolutely terrifying new book. It's called The Means of Control: How the Hidden Alliance of Tech and Government is Creating a New American Surveillance State. So, as I mentioned to you before we started the show today, Byron, this is one of those subjects that I find horrifying and fascinating in equal measure. And the idea, sort of the paranoid style idea used to be that the government had this massive amount of ability to surveil every word, thought, phone call, email of every single American all the time. But it turns out they just outsourced it in the end of the day. Talk to us about this surveillance state that has come into being and surveillance capitalism sort of writ large.
Sure. So my book is an examination of all the ways that the government now buys data, because data now is commercially available. You have lots of data brokers that are brokering not just our addresses and our consumer preferences, but also things like what we say on social media, even the movement of our devices and our cars. And this is really a new and emerging way for the government to understand the world. And it's a phenomenon that's only increasing as the amount of data that all of us generate just by purchasing things online or putting apps on our phone. As that increases, governments have become increasingly interested in buying this kind of data and using it for surveillance, for military operations, for public safety, whatever mission is important at the time. Governments have found data brokers willing to sell them data and government lawyers willing to bless these programs.
So talk to us a little bit about what are the biggest drivers in this? I mean, obviously, I think most people understand either apocryphally or generally that Facebook and Google know what you're looking at, are serving ads to you because of what you're looking at. Talk to us a little bit about how is it broken out? What are the companies that are driving the train on this? And I know there's a whole separate sector of financial data, but a lot of what you've written about is how our devices, whether computers, tablets, or phones, are a big part of this sort of enterprise.
Yeah, so I think when people think about big tech, they think about the consumer-facing companies like Google, like Apple, like Meta. The book I wrote focuses on these very obscure, sometimes they're very large, sometimes they're very small, but generally speaking, they have no consumer relationship to the average American consumer. They're business-to-business businesses, and they're data brokers. And so I sort of break out the book into 4 different generations of data brokers. The first kind of emerged in the 1960s, and they were doing stuff like vacuuming up address records from phone books or from, courthouses and property records. They were doing some basic consumer information, like they would vacuum up magazine subscriber lists, and they would try to infer things from that. So did you subscribe to Golf Digest or Dog Fancy, and what did that say about you as a consumer? Sort of basic stuff, nothing that anyone would get too exercised about these days. But, as time went on, as the technology changed and as the social norms changed, there emerged a second generation of data brokers that was essentially vacuuming up the social conversation. So brands wanted to know what people were saying about them on Twitter or on Facebook. And so these data brokers sprung up to cater to companies that wanted to understand what was being said in social spaces. Then there came to be a whole market for location and advertising based on mobile phones, because people started larding up their phones with all these apps, and these apps were collecting huge amounts of data. And so brokers emerged to collect that kind of data. And then today there's so much more data out there, right? There's all these Internet of Things devices, there are internet
Sure.
logs as we, browse the web, Bluetooth headphones, our toll transponders, all these things broadcast these weird wireless signals. And if you have the right kind of radio and you know what signals and frequencies to look for, you can just vacuum up that data. And I'm here to tell you there are data brokers that are collecting that kind of thing. Some of it's for commercial purposes, right? They're sort of sampling all the wireless devices out in the world, and they're trying to see, how many Fitbits are there? How many Apple Watches are there? Is that market share changing? Sometimes, knowing where a Wi-Fi base station is can help a car navigate in combination with its GPS. So there are commercial reasons to collect all this weird wireless information. Of course, there are surveillance reasons to collect it also. And so at
Hmm.
every one of these generations of data brokers that I describe, also, that data ended up flowing to the government, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly. But the kind of consistent phenomena is that government entities became very interested in buying it, and they found brokers willing to sell it.
So how would you divide it out? Is it mostly on the national security side? Is it on the law enforcement side? Is it on the tax enforcement side? How is government using this data?
So I mostly focus on the three-letter agencies of
Hmm.
government, both the ones with the law enforcement missions as well as the ones with the intelligence and military missions, because
Right.
those are the arms of government I think that can cause the most consequences to a person's life. But there are other arms of government that are using this kind of data for things like public health and transportation planning. So it does have sort of more benign uses that could help agencies do good planning and make good decisions. But I focus on the surveillance aspect of it because, again, that's
Hmm.
really where the state's power is at its maximum. And what I found in my reporting is that any agency with a public safety mission, a law enforcement mission, a national security mission, a military mission, or an intelligence mission is involved in some way in the bulk acquisition of commercially available information. And
Hmm.
they're putting it to use for, whatever mission is important to them. I don't want to say that there are no rules about the kind of use of this data. Like most of these agencies do have rules around who can access it and under what circumstances. So you're not just supposed to look up your wife or your neighbor or your lover. But as long as you're doing something in line with a lawful government activity, generally speaking, lawyers have blessed these programs and allowed this kind of data acquisition to go on.
So much of it strikes me as maybe they're not household names, but a lot of the big players in this, Thomson Reuters and Axcom and places like that, these are these are folks that Americans know. Maybe they've heard the name somewhere, but I don't think they understand how big an industry your data has become in this country. Would you? I mean, give us an idea of of just how big this problem is, how much they're collecting on every single person. I mean, because as I was flipping through the book, it's like the scale of this, and I feel like I'm a reasonably sophisticated person about knowing I don't have any privacy, but the scale of it is absolutely remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, when you wrap in all of digital advertising, which is essentially a data collection project, I mean, it's no exaggeration to say this is a $1 trillion industry. Probably the data broker market itself by itself is probably a couple 100 billion. But when you wrap into like digital advertising and consumer
Sure.
targeting, which, is part of this world, and there are ways for data brokers to get information off of that system, then yeah, this is a $1 trillion market, and it underpins a lot of what we see on the internet, right? Because a lot of content is paid for this way, a lot of apps are paid for this way. So this is a huge economic project. And it's one that was built to deliver consumers targeted advertising, or in the early days, targeted mailings. And now, like, the nation's biggest tech companies, the nation's biggest advertisers, even the nation's biggest publishers and app makers are all involved in this system that involves extracting a ton of behavioral information about people as they move around online and as they move through the world.
Yeah, full disclosure. Look, we use it to model voters now.
Yep.
We use it to go and look at the demographic characteristics of generally in the beginning anonymized pools of voters, but we use commercially available things to model voters. We know what they, we have some idea of what they're thinking about buying and looking at, and we know how to sort of, work our communication stuff into that. So the origin story of this goes back to a guy I knew back in the day. In a lot of ways, is John Poindexter, Navy Rear Admiral. You write about him. I've known John since I was a wee lad, let's say, in the business. Um, and Poindexter started in the wake of 9/11, trying to build out a system called total information awareness. To me, that seemed like sort of like part of the supervillain origin story of all of this stuff. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, total information awareness was this program that Poindexter tried to stand up right after 9/11. At its core, it was a lot of things. It was mainly a research program, but the
Mm-hmm.
thing that was the most controversial was this system that he envisioned of taking all this corporate data that existed out there and marrying it with the government's classified data.
Mm-hmm.
So his idea was basically like, look, these 9/11 hijackers, they had to do a bunch of stuff in order to try to carry out the attacks, right? They had to rent cars and they had to buy airline tickets and they had to scope out the airport and they bounced around all these apartments in Florida and New Jersey, and their behavior was suspicious, and lots of that behavior was cataloged in corporate records. So what if we could take all this good, interesting, secret government information and marry it with all this good, interesting data that corporate America has about everybody, and combine that into one data set, and we could maybe look for anomalies, right? We could look for weird outliers, things
Right.
that might indicate that somebody is planning a terrorist attack. So did some same individual rent a Penske truck and buy a ton of fertilizer
Right.
and book a bunch of motels along, I whatever, and that could be
Right.
suspicious behavior. Each one of those things on its own is not suspicious, but they could create these templates of possible terrorist behavior. And it's an interesting idea,
Mm-hmm.
but this was a controversial idea, to say the least. And there were a bunch of lawmakers on the Hill, including Ron Wyden, who is still around and
Right.
still fighting many of these fights. But this was kind of one of the early ones for him. But there was a cross-partisan alliance of lawmakers on both sides that were deeply uncomfortable with this proposal and essentially forced the Pentagon to wind it down. Now, I don't think the research ever really stopped. Wyden and others did win a prohibition on
Right.
actually deploying the system on Americans, but all this research on data fusion and data acquisition and secure computing and how to marry classified and unclassified data, that never really stopped. And my book is an attempt to kind of pick up the story where the public thinks it ended, which is the total information awareness program getting defunded. But in reality, a lot of these research lines survived, and a lot of them became programs that sorted through social media data or location data or this weird world of wireless signals. And so it was kind of an early harbinger of things to come, and one of the first times that Congress seemed responsive for a brief moment to a public outcry on privacy.
Right. You write a lot about sort of the how the app economy, the app system on every single person in the world's phones, it doesn't just drive a little bit of data. It drives reams and reams, tons of data all the time. Um, so let me start with this, because I know I'm thinking about what people are going to ask me when the episode's done. They're going to say, excuse me, they're going to say, what can I do about this? But most of the apps that people are using, most of the free apps, follow the rule of if it's free, you're actually the product, not the customer. Um, most people's phones are tracking more than they could ever imagine about them. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of data that comes off of phones whenever you're shown one of these banner ads, right? These
Mm-hmm.
things that are kind of annoying on websites or in apps. There's an entire architecture, a very, very complicated architecture of advertisers and technology companies that are all plugged into this same server, and that server
Mm-hmm.
has a window into all of the apps and all of the websites that you load. And the big tech companies have given you an anonymized ID, right? Supposedly anonymized, and
Anonymous.
they right, they know you as that ID. And, that's all well and good, but if you're sharing geolocation with these entities, it's very hard to anonymize your geolocation, right? Because I'm the only
Hmm.
person that wakes up here at this nice townhouse on Capitol Hill and bikes to my office in downtown Washington along the National Mall, right? Like there's no one else that has that geographic behavioral pattern. And so even
Hmm.
if you have a giant nameless map of all everyone's movements in DC, you can probably find me. It would not take
Sure.
a crack team of intelligence analysts to figure that out. And so when consumers start sharing geolocation data with these ad exchanges, lots and lots of entities are in a position to collect that geolocation data, even if they're not necessarily supposed to. It's something of a gray area, but these
Hmm.
brokers exist. They do it, and these ad companies are not very. They're not doing great due diligence on who they let on these ad servers. They're just trying to make a buck. These apps aren't doing great due diligence on configuring it the right way. They're just trying to make a buck, and so everyone's data is leaching into this very opaque system of advertisers, and there are governments lurking in there, right? There are government contractors, there are foreign governments lurking in there because it's such a rich repository of cybersecurity and cyber and geolocation data. It's basically every phone on earth, right? Like they're not all sharing geolocation, but they're sharing something about themselves every time they load up a website that has a goofy banner ad. And so
Hmm.
a repository of information that rich was always going to attract sort of the world's governments.
So, how much of our this commercially available data is being hoovered up by foreign governments? Because I have a sense that it probably has a degree of you know I sense a lot of these data brokers aren't exactly not going to make a buck if somebody with a Singapore or Hong Kong or a Xiamen uh, address is calling on them to sell them user data.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's one that led to a recent executive order that President Biden signed in February that would
Hmm.
try to crack down on this very practice. The answer is I don't know. I can tell you that there are certainly a bunch of Israeli companies that do the exact same thing and sell that capability around the world. But
Right.
I'm very tough on the United States government in this book, but in many ways that's because the U.S. government is an open and free society. It's easier for me as a reporter in Washington D.C. to report on American
Of
cyber
course. Yeah.
security capabilities. I am. I've been told extremely reliably that the Chinese and the Russians are collecting the same kind of information, and probably many more countries are lurking in these advertising markets and are setting up shell companies to acquire data. It's just harder for us to report on it because those are closed societies. So everything I report about the United States is true globally. The reporting applies generally, and we can be pretty darn sure that foreign governments have the same capabilities, are vacuuming up the same amounts of data, and are doing things with it that are probably much more nefarious than what our government is doing with it.
How much do you think that this data is being and this information is being well? I mean, deployed against Americans um,
Yeah,
as in terms of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, information operations.
It's a good question. I mean, certainly on the social media front, which I do focus about a quarter of my book on, I've certainly found plenty of instances of, police departments and government agencies lurking around social media networks, creating accounts under fake names, often mostly for the purpose of collecting information. But
Hmm.
in some cases, our military, our intelligence agencies do set up fake accounts and they try to push messages largely abroad. I think it would be against the law for the US to try to propagandize inside the United States. What foreign
Right.
governments are doing in our information ecosystem, I think that's also well documented. It's clear that nation states see these information networks as vectors to try to sway public opinion, or at the very least to inflame it or to troll. And so foreign governments are also in these spaces. And then when it comes to the data acquisition side, I've certainly seen plenty of examples where U.S. law enforcement entities, not just the big ones, right? Like, yes, the big ones are doing it,
Hmm.
namely the Department of Homeland Security and the military are very aggressive users and buyers of lots of invasive geolocation data sets including some on Americans, but also even the local police in some instances, right? Like there are small town police departments now that are getting access to these geolocation tools that let them watch, phones move around the world. And yeah, so this is the warrantless tracking of Americans by small town police departments, which, frankly, have far fewer rules about the use of these kind of invasive tools than the military and the intelligence community, which operate with like staggering amounts of rules. So there certainly is this sort of flow down effect of this information coming into local police departments and being used by local police for who knows what.
Well, I actually have a little experience with that recently. We got swatted, and I got all the public information request. I did all public information requests after it, and the police knew both my and my fiance's phones were in the house. And
Fascinating.
That the phones had not been moved prior to, it was 3 a.m. So we were sleeping.
And they knew that in real time?
Uh-huh.
They didn't have to go get a warrant or call up AT&T.
They didn't have to
they
do
just
a
knew.
damn thing. They knew immediately.
Well, that's
in this case, I was like, I'm okay with that, weirdly, because it meant it's one more reason I didn't get shot by the police when I got swatted. But it is kind of a concern. Do you think that some of these FTC cases, particularly against Meta, that are coming up, that seem to actually, under the Biden administration, shockingly seem to have some life in them, are they going to change any of the data? I mean, because the origin sources for all these data brokers are the app economy, which is mediated through either the Google App Store or the Apple App Store. Are these things going to start having an impact on whether or not the FANG companies start taking privacy more seriously?
I think the FANG companies have already started taking privacy more seriously. Even since I've started doing this reporting, Apple and eventually Google, kind of caught up to them, have made some real changes to the way that they architect their mobile phone systems. So it is a little bit harder to collect precise, 24/7 geolocation off of these devices. Apple now is very annoying about it, right? If you've accidentally let some weather app have 24/7 location, Apple will send you a routine reminder and say, like, hey, this weather app collected your location 875 times over the last week. Are you sure you want that? Like, and most users actually, given that choice, say, no, I don't really want that. That's not good. So the companies have started to make some changes in the way they design their system they're certainly not solving the problem, but they are curbing some of the ways the data brokers get information. And then I do think the FTC, in an interesting way, has emerged as a very interesting privacy enforcer. I mean, no one really gave them that role, but they've kind of taken it. And they've, done a bunch of enforcement actions against data brokers, including one of the data brokers I wrote about in my book. And so that may actually change the business calculus for some of these data brokers, right? Because some of them aren't gigantic companies. And, the prospect of a 10 or 20 or $30 million consent decree and fine, that could be a serious problem. Like to Apple, I mean, that's probably like half of a
rounding error.
And that's a rounding error. But for a smaller company, that could be a serious fine. So the FTC, I think, is making some interesting moves in this space that could potentially really have an impact on data collection. But we'll see. I mean, it's early days.
Well, are there any companies in that data broker space that are particularly terrifying or abusive or just don't seem to give a damn, that have been exploited for? I mean, I know, TLO under TransUnion has had some problems with people not entitled to access getting access to it. But are there any of these companies that are like notable bad actors?
Well, there's one in my book that I wouldn't call them like a notable bad actor, but it's kind of a funny story that showcases just how easy it is to fall into the lure of government work by almost mistake. And that's the one I was just talking about, this data broker that had some FTC investigation and eventually a settlement. And it's called X Mode, and it's changed its name a few times, but it got its start on the University of Virginia campus. It was founded by an undergraduate college student, and it started life as a goofy mobile phone app called Drunk Mode, which literally was meant to stop you from making regrettable mistakes when you were intoxicated, right? So it would like stop you from texting your ex. It would stop you from uploading embarrassing photos to Facebook or Instagram. And there was some genuine safety features built into it too, right? Like it would help you reconstruct your night if you don't really remember where you were. It had a feature that would let friends check in on one another and make sure they made it home safe. And it was kind of a novelty app. It got a lot of downloads, but over time the founder realized, I'm not making a ton of money just trying to charge 99 cents or putting banner ads in it. Maybe the location data that comes off these phones of all our users is more valuable than charging 99 cents. And so he pivoted to become more of a location company, and they were genuinely trying to build a commercial location business. But over time, they were in the Washington area and they knew people who knew people. And a government contractor comes in one day and says, hey, you've got your software inside hundreds of apps. You're helping them collect location. You're paying them for it. You're a location company. What if we put a few extra lines of code in there? And we started scanning the signal environment around all the phones that are, you have millions of phones in the world. We'll ask the user if they'll turn on their Wi-Fi radio and their Bluetooth, and we'll collect all the signals around the phone. And,
wow,
this was a government contractor, and that data was going to some sort of military project. And so I kind of joke in the book that this is the weapon from the Dark Knight, right? This is the computer virus that Batman turns on.
Right.
Has the phones like emit echolocation bursts, and then finds the Joker, and then it's like, this is too powerful. We'll never do this again. We're shutting it down. They were doing that with Bluetooth signals. And for what purpose, I never quite figured out. It might have been a pilot. It might have been some genuinely interesting cyber capability that the government had figured out. But I'm here to tell you that there was some weird government signal collection experiment running on millions of phones worldwide. And it started because an undergraduate made a kind of a goofy
drunk mode app. Wow.
Drunk mode app. Yeah.
Wow. You mentioned how Apple will now remind you to turn off location data or to turn off access to your photos or turn off whatever the thing is. Most of these location data, like these exchanges that the app folks build out or sign on to, they semi-anonymize your data. But the semi-anonymization of the data, I can tell you from voter file experience, it's not that anonymous. How can people improve their chances of shielding their activities at all, other than not having any apps on their phone?
It's hard. I would certainly not let anything have persistent 24/7 access to your location. I would also be very cautious about granting random apps access to your photo rolls and to your contact list, right? Because those are pretty valuable and personal data sets. And, maybe you trust some of them, right? Like a photo app may have a good reason. And if it's, a big company like Instagram or something, it seems fine. But don't let some random game have access to that.
Right.
Be careful with that stuff. So really check your permissions. Second, if you're doing anything even remotely sensitive, right? Like you're dealing with, like you're a political consultant, I'm a journalist. We're not dealing in state secrets here, but I certainly like to have a little privacy when I'm chatting with sources sometimes. So you please use Signal, use WhatsApp. Use
I never
Apple's
said.
iMessage.
Somebody asked me that, like, I never get emails from you. I was like, I know.
Exactly. And so there really are these privacy protecting services out there that they're not perfect. You could still have your data seized. You could be hacked. Nothing's perfect, but they do add a little bit more privacy to your life. I mean, there are some cool obscurity and anonymity technologies, and I use that word carefully, but there are VPNs. Like you now you have to trust the VPN though, so they're not a cure-all either. Apple's private relay is actually, I think it's cool
pretty solid, right?
Yeah. If you kind of look into it. And then finally, I would just tell people to return to the basics of capitalism and pay money for things on the internet.
Yes.
Do not be so stingy that you're unwilling to pay 99 cents or $1.99 for an app, because when an app can't collect money from the public, that's when it turns to doing sketchy things. And too many consumers have this notion that everything should be free online, and really that's
Mm-hmm.
not how it works, right? Like engineering talent is expensive, server space is expensive,
Mm-hmm.
lawyers to draw up your privacy policy are expensive. So none of these things are free. And so when companies can't count on you to pay, $1.99 for their app, or even, $2 or $3 a month, that's really when they turn to say, well, we got to make some money here. I gotta
Right.
gotta feed my employees, families, and that's when
Mm-hmm.
they'll turn to
Mm-hmm.
monetizing your data. So I'd really recommend that people get over this sort of immaturity about being
Right.
unwilling to pay a few bucks on the internet for a service that they find valuable. Because if you find it valuable, you should be willing to pay a few bucks here.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, Byron, like I said, it's a terrifying book. It's a valuable book, and I think people need to really look at it and read it, because we are in a weird moment where your data is more valuable than almost any other asset most people have these days. They
Yeah, I
they
mean,
they they have become the target, and as a sort of holdover with some libertarian leanings, I worry like hell about the degree to which government is easily able to buy this stuff, well beyond the scope of or the purview of any sort of legal need, and can mostly do it without a warrant.
mhm. I
So,
think that's fair, and that's what drove me to write this book.
well, folks, I really recommend Means of Control by Byron Tau. It is how the hidden alliance of tech and government created a new American surveillance state. What are you working on next?
So actually, friendly correction. I actually left the Wall Street Journal in September, so I'm currently at
Oh,
a nonprofit newsroom called Notice, and we're doing some cool
oh
stuff there.
yeah,
We're
yeah, yeah. I've
helping
heard of it.
to
Yeah,
yeah, so we're brand new. We launched a few weeks ago, and we're trying to train the next generation of young reporters. They have some mid-career folks like me kicking around, and to help them and to be
fantastic.
mentors and to teach classes. And so, any young journalist that's interested, we host a 2-year fellowship for early career
And it's
journalists. It's paid.
NOTUS, folks.
NOTUS, yes. So check that out. And I do reporting there as well, mostly on the same stuff, tech, privacy, but with a little more focus on accountability and investigations.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, thank you again, Byron, for coming on the enemies list. Look forward to having you back soon. And we will talk to you then.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So my rant today, my enemies list entry for today, is every one of you Republican and MAGA world assholes who decided to make DEI the villain in the Baltimore Bridge collapse. 20 people died with that. It's an accident. It wasn't caused by DEI or wokeism or liberalism or progressivism or any other ism. It was a catastrophe. 6 of the people, by the way, who died were guys who were there working on the bridge in the middle of the night, and they were all from other countries. They were all here trying to make a better life, and they all died, working a job damn near minimum wage, and they plunged into the icy water after the ship hit the bridge. And they've not been recovered. So all of you trying to make this about DEI, all of you trying to make this about race, all of you trying to make this about using Baltimore as a code word for black, you're all on the enemies list. This is the kind of tragedy that once in a dim and distant past, everyone understood was something we all have to pull together and face. But you folks seem to think that it's funny or amusing or good trolling to try to turn it into an attack on wokeism and race. Get the hell out of here. You're all on the enemies list.